from University of Belgrade Faculty of Philosophy, Department of Classics, and her topic is Doctors and Trials, Physicians as Witnesses in Demosthenes Contra Cononem and Cicero's Pro Rege Deiotaro. Anna, when you're ready, feel free to begin.
Hello. So while diseases and maladies have always followed humankind, recent pandemic had only accentuated the fact that, all the technology aside, humanity remains plagued by the same old problems. And although some topics, disease as a punishment for transgression, for example, are often researched from Sophocles to Savonarola, the status of physicians, dual now as it was in the antiquity, remains in the background. Oratory is not only an invaluable contemporary source for social history, but could also refine our understanding of certain events long past and help us better understand the dynamic speaker wanted to create. The main thought behind this study, based on comparative analysis of two speeches, is to outline the position and standing of physicians in the 4th century Athens and 1st century Rome, as represented by the role of doctors as witnesses in Demosthenes Contra Cononem and Cicero's Pro Rege Deiotaro. We believe that the attitudes expressed in these orations have a conformist and conventional character, and that those issues warrant more than a preliminary research. Demosthenes' speech, a logography for a victim of a beating, describes the subsequent injuries in medical terms and great detail. Cicero's oration was delivered in defense of Galatian king Deiotarus Philoromaios, Pompey's staunch ally and supporter during the civil war, against the most dangerous accusation of all, that the king was planning to assassinate Caesar himself while the dictator was his guest. Demosthenes, in this speech, manages not to victimize Aristotle again, but to transfer disgust to the perpetrator, a feat commendable even in modern times. Cicero had to deliver his oration in front of Caesar, always taking good care not to offend, patronize, or bore him. The image of physician that emerges is dual, but their authoritas, as we shall see, is undisputable even when refuted. Medical thought developed in Hellas parallel to the rhetoric and philosophy, and by the late 4th century, Ionian cities of Kos and Cnidus established themselves as the centers of medical education. Greek physicians were already famous in the 6th century and were appreciated far and wide, as we can see from the example of Theseus of Cnidus, who was a court doctor of Artaxerxes II in the early 1400s. As we see from common enough jokes and stories, doctors were sometimes seen as conjurers, while also contritely regarded as a source of great auctoritas, which could even be transferred to those lacking. Maybe this is the reason behind such a meticulous care to distinguish medicine from irrational medicine in a number of early treatises. Nevertheless, the status of physicians and their work remained interspersed with the domain of fate and destiny, certainly well into around the middle of the 3rd century BC and probably later. Even Aristotle came from a medical family with connections to the Macedonian court. Most importantly, physicians could rise to the position of city doctors on public funds, which shows the respect of their peers, and they seemingly earned well, not only in Athens, or at least were frequent enough, as we see from a number of sources. So in Graecia capta ferrum victoriam cepit, as Horace brilliantly commented, Greek doctors had, as we have seen, a long-standing respect both in Greek polis and in Hellenistic and Oriental states. But even though one of them, Posidonius, was in elite enough circles to be friends with Cicero and Pompey, Greek medicine was sometimes still regarded with suspicion. Interestingly enough, the fact that a great number of Greek doctors in Roman and others, as we shall see in Cicero's oration, employ were slaves and did not affect that attitude as much as mistrust towards the medicine itself. We shall now take a closer look on Demosthenes' oration. And Demosthenes had not only been one of the greatest politicians of his time, and one of the greatest orators of his culture. He was also very famous and an industrious logographer. And since every Athenian citizen was required to speak for himself, logography, the skill of writing speeches for others, started to gain popularity, culminating after the 4th century BC. Logography was not considered a respectable profession, even though it could bring considerable earnings. So Demosthenes, whose logographic career advanced after his legal battles with scheming relatives, seems to have chosen his cases very carefully. Since Demosthenes had to voluntarily support the liturgiae, as every other Athenian citizen with political ambitions, and because he did not manage to restore in full his father's property, it is both probable and plausible that logography was one of Demosthenes' most important sources of income by the early 350s. One of Demosthenes' most commented speeches was written for others, his Oratio Contra Cononem, almost always dated in 341 BC, and it concerns the case of assault Conon and his sons committed on Aristotle, probably one of Demosthenes' affluent acquaintances and plausibly even one of his friends, given the great politician's care in choosing his cases. We can even presume how the litigant would call upon a logographer, furnishing him with information about the case, which the latter would construct into a speech in Demosthenes' case, perhaps even consulting the litigant in legal matters and interviewing witnesses. Contra Cononem starts with speakers, Aristotle's statement that following the advice of his family and friends, maybe even Demosthenes himself, he decided to charge Conon with a less serious private suit for assault, though he could press on with a more serious charge of hubris and robbery, providing first unnamed witnesses for the case. We learned that Conon, supported by a number of his friends, attacked Aristotle and his friend Panostratus in a drunken state. Aristotle, severely beaten, received first help from the passers-by, and on their way to his home, the group was met by the victim's relative, Euxiteus, and the friend Medius. Aristotle then goes to describe his injuries, obviously using his physician's phrases, lending the Doctoritis to his perhaps less than ideal credibility. Presumably, it is now Euxiteus and Medius who testify about Aristotle's injuries, as does the doctor. A doctor, the same one, and others also testify about the severity of Aristotle's injuries and the difficulties of his convalescence. With these testimonies, Aristotle's case appears complete, but he continues on, anticipating Conon's excuses of being only a bystander, pointing out that even verbal assault is against the law. Then once again, the story revolves around witnesses. Aristotle accentuates Conon's insisting that Aristotle's witnesses swear to their testimony, and finally, when Conon suggested the torture of a number of Aristotle's slaves, Aristotle and his witnesses called out his challenge as a delaying tactic. Aristotle compares Conon's witnesses, his drinking buddies, notorious libertines and brutes, whose testimony was manufactured to suit Conon's needs, to his own independent passers-by and the doctor, the sort of witnesses one ought to produce before the democratic court, once again ascertaining the importance and social standing of his witnesses. Then Aristotle goes on to condemn Conon's involvement of his family and especially his anticipated oaths upon their heads, so when he offers his free oath, it is conventional in accordance with the entire oration. Now we finally get to the core of Aristotle's landing of authority in any way possible, be it by witnesses or physicians' auctoritas, or even religion itself. It seems he was no stranger to such roles, at least judging by Conon's assessment that the Dicas would deem those allegations against Aristotle credible. Furthermore, it seems that this incident had some kind of religious background and that both Aristotle and Conon's son were members of rival groups. But where Aristotle had at least simulacrum of understanding for the misjudgments of the youth, he had none for the actions of a grown man, and he depicts the actions of Conon's group in an inversion of contempt for conventional values. More than that, by linking religious offenses to Conon, Aristotle characterizes him as a sacrilegious villain, not a common feat in oratory to this day. We shall now take a closer look to Cicero's oration. Period in which it was delivered was as tumultuous for Rome as 4th century was for Athens, and the most prominent Roman politicians and imperators of that period, Marcus Tullius Cicero, stands out as a rare example of statesman trying to lead by persuasion rather than bully his way in. In the year 45 BC, when Cicero presented his oration at Caesar's house, Pompey's sons were defeated at Munda. Cicero had written his Cato and received Caesar's anti-Cato, and Caesar, the only living Roman Cicero criticizes in his Brutus, had acquired numerous honors from becoming Pontifex Maximus to dictator in perpetuum. Caesar had even acted as a single judge in the cases of Ligarius and King Deiotaro, and these orations, though in form of judicial speeches, were delivered under unusual circumstances in the dictator's home, perhaps in the presence of his concilium. King Deiotarus Philoramaios, a tetrarch from the western part of Galatia, has been a staunch ally of the Romans ever since the Mithridatic Wars, for which he received his epithet and the title of Rex from the Senate. After supporting Pompey in person at Phaselis, Deiotarus switched his allegiance to Caesar after Pompey's death and sent him troops to Alexandria. Then Caesar, having attended to the problems of Alexandria, turned his attention to Asia Minor. And after Ariobarzanes, Cappadocian king, received Clementia Caesaris, Caius Iulius had continued towards Ella, and somewhere near the Galatian border was met with King Deiotaro, who appeared dressed as a supplicant to beg Caesar's forgiveness for his support of Pompey. Though Caesar had refuted Deiotarus' argument of not being able to determine between warring sides in Rome, he allowed him to keep the title of king. Then he went on to accept Deiotarus' hospitality, and it seems unusual that Caesar would wait for 2 years to address the plot he was aware of. King Deiotarus was charged with trying to assassinate Caesar while he was his guest by Castor, Secundarius' son, and his relative. Caesar had had inquiry in his home and sat as a sole judge, but it is not known that he had decided on this matter, and his death put an end to this trial. Anomalies of this case do not end with this. Not only it is difficult to specify the judicial procedure in question, even a formal prosecutor cannot be discerned because Cicero mentions only Castor and Phidippus, and it is doubtful that Castor, a foreigner, could plead a criminal case in Rome. Phidippus, in turn, was a doctor and Deiotarus' slave who came to Rome as a member of the king's entourage, but was bought off by Castor, only to recant before repeating his charges. As we shall see, because of his Auctoritas as a physician, Cicero takes extraordinary measures to discredit him as a witness. Cicero works with the peculiarities of this case, not against them. Maybe those circumstances are the reason behind his conformity to the canon on forensic oration. Stating the defense, Cicero comments on the peculiarities of the case. Deploring a slave for taking part in the accusation of his master, he comments on the absence of a corona and manifests his faith in the virtues of the judge. Opening the speech proper, Cicero criticizes the accusers, advising Caesar to prevent a foreign client from feeling insecure about Rome's assurances, probably because of the dictator's plans for Eastern campaign. Cicero then turns his attention to the main charge, treating with open contempt and humor, opting for the strategy of repeating the accuser's narrative and commenting it directly to Caesar, taking extra steps to refute not only the doctor's statement, but his reputation. So Cicero, quoting the doctor, addresses his accusation that Deiotarus had wanted to kill Caesar in any way other than poison, if he had already decided to confide in his physician, a skilled one at that. More than that, similarly to what we have seen in Demosthenes' oration, religion is brought forth when arguments need backing. Be that as it may, Caesar had changed his mind, and by the time it was too late for the conspiracy to take place. Cicero logically comments that if the assassination plot was real, then it would not have been a problem to wait for an hour or two, contrasting the accusation by portraying Caesar's enjoining the king's hospitality in accordance with the guest's high status. Cicero goes further to ask Caesar if he had, at any time, noticed anything at all that was not orderly or calm and within the manners of a serious and pious man. And affecting being unable to follow this absurd accusation, asks if Deiotarus arrayed in the bath bronze statues that could not be transported into the dining room after rather than real assassins, effectively dismissing the charge. He then goes on to dismantle subsidiary indictment, which he says he responds, no longer taking them seriously, as is the case with the charge that Deiotarus had danced naked in the public upon hearing of the death of Domitius Calvinus. Cicero comments that given the fact that the king had had a lifelong contact with the Romans, he was too civilized to be guilty of this offense. Cicero then goes on to juxtapose Deiotarus' old age and infirmity as seen during the Battle of Phaselis 3 years earlier, when he had to be lifted on his horse and was universally admired just for remaining in his seat. To Castor's preening and unwillingness to be restrained by Cicero himself, before turning to a tirade about the social impiety of bribing slaves to betray their masters, using his orational trademark, o tempore mores, for the fourth time ever. Finally, in the peroration, Cicero states that his prime goal is to reconcile Caesar with Deiotarus, who not only bears no grudge against the dictator, but is grateful to Caesar for easing his task as a ruler with relieving him much of his kingdom. Acting as an advisor, Cicero makes his final point. The outcome of this trial will be a victory either for the cruelty of Deiotarus' enemies or the compassion of Caesar, ending his speech with the notion that Clementia should be the basis of Rome's foreign policy. The portrait of the physician that emerges from these orations is one of undoubted social dignity and authority that even the dubious personal qualities of slavery cannot fully compromise, and even religion had to be employed to support Rhetor's statement, as we have seen in Cicero's speech. Doctors' Auctoritas is so great that it can compensate even the complicated history of the accuser, as shown in Demosthenes' one. Both of these orations are private and judicial, and both rely strongly on physicians as witnesses, be it to affirm or refute their testimonies. The fact that Demosthenes finds it important to highlight that Aristotele's witnesses were the sort of witnesses one ought to produce before the democratic court shows that the social standing of doctors was rarely disputed. Cicero further proves this notion by continuously drawing attention to Philippus's disloyalty to his master rather than attacking him on the professional plane, going so far to reluctantly admit to Philippus's medical skill and experience. Demosthenes uses the physician's auctoritas to smooth over Aristotle's potential troubles from history, and Cicero goes even further, emphasizing Philippus's medical competence and drawing a logical conclusion that if indeed Deiotaro had planned to assassinate Caesar, it would be imprudent of him to deprive himself of said physician's medical knowledge, opting for assassination by force instead of poison. As we have seen, physicians are of utmost importance for these orations, and their auctoritas is such that it could make or break the case. If Aristotle's lack of auctoritas transferred to his witnesses, Cononem, loosely connected to the case in comparison to his sons, could walk free for both the insult and the injury. If it weren't for Philippus, the charge against Deiotaro would have been even more flippant than it is. We believe that much more could be gleaned from this aspect of orations in general, and that those issues warrant more than a preliminary research, which would help us better understand social relations and problems of antiquity. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, Nina?
Sorry, I was trying to clap. I misclicked the raise hand.
No problem. Thank you, Anna, for this lovely presentation.
Thank you.
And now I will give word to our next participant, Isidora Smolović from University of Belgrade Faculty of Law. And her topic is Euthanasia in Ancient Greece and its correlation with the Hippocratic Oath then and now. So Isidora, I will try to pass you. Okay, you can. Okay, you can
do that.
the
Thank you.
PowerPoint. Okay, you can begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, hello everyone. My name is Isidora Smolović, and I would like to greet everybody present and to say that it's really an honor to be able to participate in this kind of event, considering that I'm just in my first year of studies. As Professor previously said, my topic for today is euthanasia in ancient Greece and its correlation with the Hippocratic Oath then and now. Question of euthanasia is a very vexed one and has been around since the dawn of time. Today we find ourselves wondering if our right to live, our primary human right, also means having the right to die. Firstly, sorry. Yes, sorry. I would like to start with the origin of word euthanasia. Word euthanasia originated in early 17th century, and its etymological root comes from the Greek language, where eu means well or good, and thanatos means death, which leads us to its literal translation, good, death, or mercy killing. So it is supposed to represent something inherently positive and good, but the word euthanasia didn't only mean mercy killing in ancient Greece. It also connected with spiritual state of the dying person, a happy ending that crowned a good life, and it also associated with sleep. It represented some kind of eternal sleep. So we can conclude that the meaning of word euthanasia wasn't fixated to only one phenomenon. Its usage was much more liberal, contrary to modern times, but where it represents only one thing and it only fits in medical brackets. There are, just a moment. There are many divisions of euthanasia, many kinds of euthanasia, but the primary division is on voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. Like its name suggests, voluntary euthanasia means with the consent of the patient, and involuntary euthanasia means without the consent of the patient. There are also remarks about the involuntary and non-voluntary euthanasia, but I will not be getting into that. I will be now talking about forms of voluntary euthanasia because they are going to be mentioned throughout this work, and I just wanted to make it clear what is without any confusion. There are many more forms of voluntary euthanasia, but I singled out these three: active euthanasia, passive euthanasia, and physician-assisted suicide. When we think about human euthanasia, we usually, the first thing that comes to our mind is active euthanasia, or doing something with the intent of ending someone's life, like injecting a drug that nothing else but ends someone's life. And this type of euthanasia is most frowned upon in the medical community. Next to that, we have passive euthanasia, which is withdrawing treatment, withholding, giving treatment, and that resulting in someone's death. So it's basically indirectly killing someone. Withdrawing life support and withholding life support are two different things, but also not relevant to my topic right now. And last but not least, we have physician-assisted suicide, which involves a physician or a doctor who provides the patient with a treatment that is going to end their life, but the doctor does not actually give the treatment themselves. Instead, the patient administers it themselves. Now, finally, getting to the antiquity. I will be firstly talking about the stances of euthanasia and suicide through works of three most famous tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Firstly, we have Aeschylus. Aeschylus dabbled in questions of suicide in his play Prometheus Bond. Prometheus Bond tells us the story of a Titan, Prometheus, who was punished by the Olympian Zeus for giving humanity the gift of fire. In this play, we see character Eos' struggle and suicidal thoughts, and Eos' psychological problems were on display for all the viewers, readers to dissect. And Eos says, "I would prefer to die once and for all than suffer such afflictions every day." From this, we can see that Aeschylus was not against euthanasia or simply taking one's life in order to relieve them of further suffering. We are going to see similar pattern behaving where tragedians and philosophers alike do not judge suicide as long as there is good reasoning behind it. But good reasoning is also subjective, what can be found good and what can be found bad. Next, we have Sophocles. There are mentions of death, suicide in two of his plays, but what is interesting about them is the conflicting opinions that can be seen. Firstly, we have Antigone, which is a very dear play to me. In Antigone, we are not only going to be focusing on what the character said, but who said what. First, we have "No man is mad enough to court his death," which was said by the chorus. Why is that important? Because the chorus in antiquity was usually there to tell us the objective side, to tell us the general opinion, and seeing as that the chorus is judging somebody's opinion or somebody's decision to end their life also shows us that it was not really good to want to end life willingly. On the other hand, we have Antigone, who says, "And even if I die in the act, that death will be a glory. I will lie with one I love and was loved by." Here we see that Antigone is showing her loyalty to her brothers and all that. It's really honorable, it's really great. But we also know that throughout the play, Antigone was not really positively looked at. So seeing as those words are coming from her mouth, we know that it was not really okay to wish for death. So we can see that Sophocles in this play strongly condemns the idea of wanting to end one's life willingly. But Sophocles' stance changes in Women of Trachis, where through characters Hylas and Heracles, son and father, we see him debating the issue of assisted suicide. We see that at the end of the play, father, Heracles, begs his son to end his life, since he is in such state of discomfort and pain that he can't even do it himself. With the apprehension of his son, but think again, what is it you ask me to do? Become my father's murderer, become defiled with blood. We see that the idea of assisted euthanasia, as we would call it today, is still questionable. Nevertheless, Sophocles tries to justify those actions through father's words, rather want to heal my suffering, become the only one to ease my burden of grief. Here we see the same situation as Aeschylus, where he's justifying assisted suicide or suicide that is backed up by wanting to end someone's suffering. And lastly, we have Euripides. On 2 occasions, Euripides speaks on euthanasia and disagrees with the idea of it because he values life deeply. The first case of an individual seeking euthanasia is in Iphigenia in Taurissa, where Orestes, a character of weak mind, tries to starve in order to die. This may not seem like anything special to us today, because starvation today is not considered a form of euthanasia, but in antiquity, starvation was considered one of the methods of euthanasia. Today, it would be questionable, it would be deemed as an eating disorder rather than euthanasia, but we are focusing on the antiquity. And in the other play, Iphigenia in Aulis, to make his stance on life clear, once again, he is indirectly shaming those who opt for unhonorable death or suicide. That would be all from our tragedians, and now I will be getting to the philosophers. Firstly, we have Pythagoras and the Pythagorean Brotherhood. We all know Pythagoras from his Pythagorean theorem, which we all hopefully learned in school. But what is kind of interesting about him is that it is difficult to differentiate his works, his teachings, from those of his disciples, because he never left any written work behind. All we know from him is what was quoted by his disciples, by his students. Then we know that the Pythagorean Brotherhood relied heavily on religion, and their very vocal opposition to any kind of euthanasia is somewhat understandable. It is against God to behave in such a manner that would prematurely bring one's life or another's to an end. They had a mixture of philosophical and theological beliefs about life, thus forbidding euthanasia or anything that harms the sacred life. These teachings became susceptible on premises that God does actually exist and that all men have a moral duty to follow command of God. If we take these factors out of the equation, what is left is an easily defeatable theory. What is also interesting to know or to note about the Pythagorean Brotherhood is that they were strongly against any kind of surgery, even life-saving surgery. So their stances are kind of questionable on the medical field. Next, we have Plato. And Plato indirectly spoke about euthanasia, and we can see that in one of his most famous and widely read dialogues, Republic. Then he taught that one should not nurture people whom are not capable of living, because they do not benefit themselves or the state. They taught those who are sickly and immoderate by nature have nothing to do with their lives alone, or to anyone else. So medical skill must not be for their sake. They must not be treated, even when they are richer than Mida himself. Here we can see that he touches upon elitism, but also not the topic of today. We can also see that even though he wasn't an active euthanasia supporter, he approved of passive euthanasia, meaning that suffering with those who were no longer able to live fulfilling lives should be ended by all means. This is the pattern I was talking about previously. As long as you have justified reasoning, it is okay to find another solution for your life. In this case, euthanasia. The support of euthanasia in his work drops all religious remarks and shows its independent and completely worldly stance on this topic, contrary to the Pythagorean brotherhood, which based all its standings on religious beliefs. Next, we have Aristotle. Aristotle was also indirectly deals with euthanasia. While mentioning suicide in some of his books, he says that to commit suicide is to do oneself injustice. He doesn't go about this problem in moral concept, but instead he views it as breaking the law. Aristotle disapproves of making suicide a means for people to escape power, love, or anything that is painful. He says that that only shows one cowardice. We can also see that Aristotle views this on a worldly level. He doesn't involve religion or anything higher and above to this question. And then we have Seneca and the Stoics. I think that this quote from Seneca's work would perfectly depict their whole stance of euthanasia, and I'm going to read it because I find it really interesting how they thought in that way so long ago. For me, living is not a good, but living well. Accordingly, the wise man will live as long as he ought, not as long as he can. He always reflects concerning the quality and not the quantity of his life. As soon as there are many events in his life that give him trouble and disturb his peace of mind, he sets himself free. He holds that it makes no difference to him whether his taking off be natural or self-inflicted, whether it comes later or earlier. He does not regard it with fear, as if it were a great loss, for no man can lose very much when but a driblet remains. It is not a question of dying earlier or later, but of dying well or ill. We can see from what I just read that the Stoics viewed death as the inevitable and natural resolution of human life itself. The Stoics were not the first in philosophy to approve the act of committing suicide, but they viewed philosophy as not only the right to live as well, but as the right of dying well. The fact that many Stoics committed suicide, one of them being Seneca himself, shows that they truly believed and approved of what they saw as an important test of a person's moral strength and stature. And finally, we are getting to the Hippocratic Oath. Now, very controversial passage because it involves not only euthanasia, but abortion. I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody if asked for it, nor will make a suggestion to end this effect. Similarly, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy. In purity and holiness, I will guard my life and my art. The simply stated principle supports several moral rules. Do not kill, do not cause pain or suffering, do not incapacitate, do not cause offense, and do not deprive others of the goods of life. But the important thing to note is that the Hippocratic Oath was not law-abiding. It was, however, binding to the Hippocratic doctors, but not to regular doctors. And seeing as that in ancient Greece there was a trend of poisoning, many people opted to call the Hippocratic doctors because they knew that those doctors could not do anything to harm them, could not give them poison instead of remedies, while ordinary doctors could do that because they never took this oath, and this oath was not binding to them in any shape or form. Now we're getting to the modern times. There are many opinions on the Hippocratic Oath and euthanasia, and doctors have different opinions on euthanasia. Here we have some doctors that are against euthanasia, and they deem that medicine is there to heal and cure, not to kill. They think that performing euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide or any form of voluntary euthanasia directly violates the Hippocratic Oath. One doctor thinks that asking a physician to perform assisted suicide is like asking them to breach two primary ethic codes, non-maleficence and beneficence. Non-maleficence, or primum non nocere, which we know from Latin, was there a long time ago. Some think that death is not the only last resort. For example, one doctor thinks that calling for supportive counseling is a better solution than assisting in committing suicide for patients at the end of their journey. The oath is viewed as the fundamental moral principle of medicine pledged by doctors for centuries as they attempt to cure and relieve suffering without injuring the patient. Now we have those who are in favor of euthanasia. Doctors on this side of spectrum question the validity of the standard that was established approximately 2,400 years ago. Nowadays, the oath is rarely taken, and if taken, it is far from its original form. There are parts of the oath that prohibit surgery altogether, and that itself shows that the oath is outdated and should not be looked upon as the standard for what we can and can't do. Also, the context in which physician might end someone's life has changed. For example, Hippocrates never had a patient on a ventilator or any life support machine. Hence, he never could have imagined what circumstances might lead to a doctor deciding it was best for their patient to not struggle anymore in a vegetative state. To prolong a death in some cases isn't helpful and goes directly against primum non nocere because it can be counterproductive. Suffering can't be suffering is just not justifiable anymore in modern times. And that would be all from me. I hope you enjoyed my little presentation, and if you have any questions for me, I would love to answer them or hear my opinion.
Thank you, Isidora, very much. So now we have some time for discussion and questions. If anyone has one, please raise your hand or type it in the chat box. I'll give a minute or two, maybe if someone is typing. I can add a commentary afterwards and a small question for Isidora. But just to see if someone else has a question as well. Okay, I don't see any hands or questions. So regarding Isidora, your topic, just want to say I haven't researched euthanasia in ancient Greece yet. This is like the first time I've heard something more about it. It's very interesting from the sources that you chose. The only philosopher or person that mentions the law and breaking the law is Aristotle. And that's interesting because we don't know if there were actual laws in ancient Greece. I mean, I don't know because I haven't still researched it. That's something that you can also research as well. If there were if we have preserved actual laws that are dealing with euthanasia itself, because from this Aristotle sentence, it would be breaking the law. We don't know if he is in a way giving his moral judgment of euthanasia, if he thinks that's murder, and that's why he's breaking the law. Or there were actual provisions of law which forbade euthanasia and found doctors responsible for helping a patient, etc. It's particularly interesting because, as you have mentioned, there were doctors which were called to provide poison. Were those doctors prosecuted or not? Does it mean that euthanasia was in a way still allowed and only Hippocratic doctors were against it because they found it immoral? That's a very interesting topic to research, if there are actual laws that forbade explicitly euthanasia or not. So that's a small commentary. I just wanted to ask you, what is your opinion, based on everything that you've read? What do you think about euthanasia today, in your opinion? Should it be allowed? Should there be any exceptions, etc., etc.?
Well, thank you for your commentary and for your question. I think I'm a very liberal person. I really like to think outside of the box. And I think that why not? Euthanasia should be permitted. If somebody wants to end their life, they're going to do it one way or another. So I think that doing it in a healthy space with their family present, I think that's a good thing. And I don't think that doctors now should be persecuted for providing patients with safe ways to end their life. I think that's okay, because in Switzerland, in many countries, it is allowed. And many people travel to Switzerland to get euthanasia performed on them. And we see that many people have filed complaints to the European Court of Human Rights, because our primary life is to live with honor, to have a good life. And if we are not able, for example, when somebody has a disability and they know that in a couple of years they're going to be completely in a vegetative state and they want to end their suffering of their family, why not give them the opportunity to have honorable death, to just live their life to the fullest while they still can, and have the happiest memories? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Georgie, I see you raised your hand, and afterwards, Nina and Georgie, please. Yeah.
First of all, thank you, presenters. It was a pleasure hearing about your works. I just want to kind of continue the discussion about the euthanasia and in today's context. And I want to ask Isidora, what do you think? Does allowing euthanasia, as you said, violate the principle declared in, for example, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that human life is the highest good? And how do you comment that? I mean, if we accept that you can basically end one's life under some certain prescripted circumstances, of course, does that violate the principle that human's life is the highest good? I just want to know your opinion. It's really a critic.
Okay, so I think that just having an opinion that something is the highest good is really a subjective matter. For me, the highest good isn't the human life, for example. So I think that doesn't, if we are going to look at it by the law, we have the right to live, and we should also have the right to die. And human life being the highest good, okay, but what kind of human life? Not that, I mean, if I don't consider my life worth living, I should have the opinion and the option to end it. That's just my opinion. I don't think that the highest good can be deemed as one and only one thing. I think that's a subjective matter completely. I hope that this answers this question.
Yes, of course, but what's with the coded definition of the highest goods? I mean, for example, the Declaration of Human Rights and similar laws, similar abiding documents, I mean.
Yeah, but well, that is the definition right now. We cannot guarantee that that definition isn't going to change in 2 years, in 5 years. So I think that we should look past it, look at the broader picture, not just stand on one point, because where would humanity be if we only looked at things that were there 2,000 years ago? And I think that things change very rapidly with the modern technology and everything. My views aren't the same as views of my parents, and I think that if not now, things are going to change very soon.
Thank you for the answer. Perhaps we can discuss this topic later, some other day.
Okay, so now we have Nina and Igor. Nina, do you want to go first, or should I let Igor and then...
Let Igor.
Okay. Igor, you can you yeah. Okay.
Thank you for Thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to add to this discussion, I don't think it's the matter of whether life is the highest value, but whether we can dispose with all the values. Can you only dispose with, let's say, material values or some personal values, even life? And that is, let's say, some philosophical topic for the oncoming century, and also under which circumstances could euthanasia be implemented. And I think that's actually the, let's say, the biggest problem, when and under which circumstances we could implement it. Just how and when is it allowed, you know, because sometimes in those states the subjective, let's say, the subjective state of a patient could sometimes not be in terms with reality, so they could get better, but the Isidora's example with that handicapped person is on spot, but I think it's actually just really hard to regulate it, and that is one of the reasons, I believe, besides the moral ones, why the countries are not getting into regulating euthanasia in such a way. I think it's really a big project for everyone. And just doing it absolutely liberally to let everyone have an assisted suicide, I think it's a bit too much for everyone. So that would be it.
Thank you, Igor. And Nina.
Just two very brief questions for both speakers. Uh, for Anna, I'm sorry if you mentioned something at the very beginning because I was maybe 2 minutes late for the start. I know you focused on these two speeches, but I'm curious, did you generally, more briefly, maybe consider any other forensic speeches where doctors are mentioned? Now, I'm no expert on the subject, so I don't know if there are others where doctors appear as witnesses, but I know there are others where doctors are at least mentioned because there are some medical issues at stake. And for Isidora, were you perhaps considering, I know there is a theory and there's an article on the origins of the Hippocratic Oath. I can look it up for you if you haven't encountered it. There's a theory according to which perhaps the ethical part of the Hippocratic Oath that we are mainly focusing to in this case is a later edition, that it's not as old as the first part. So how would did you even consider that, and how would it fit in the context of this research? Thank you both.
Should I start first, or those two orations are only ones in Demosthenes and Cicero's, both orations that had any result as for a doctor as a witness. I haven't researched the oratory in itself. I have only researched Demosthenes and Cicero. So those are the only two orations that had doctors as witnesses. If Cicero or Demosthenes mention physicians in their orations, I have not researched that because those orations could not, these two orations are completely compatible, and they cannot be, they can be compared. For example, the standing of the doctor, the accusation, the fact that the whole case revolves around the physician and their testimony, those are the only that were compatible in that sense, and the only with the result. But I cannot say for the oration, for the oratory in general. I have not researched that. I simply haven't had the time.
Thank you.
And I think, I'm sorry, and I think it is a complex question and cannot be, it should, a researcher should be totally concentrated on the matter. I don't think it is easy to find the results in that sense. Thank you.
Okay, so here I am. I don't think that the passage I quoted is in the original form of the Hippocratic Oath. I don't even know if the original form is saved, but from my research, this was the most known passage, and I think that of course it changed through time, but this is the latest I could find. Maybe I'm wrong. Please don't take my word that that is the only form, but from what I gathered, it was something that they used, and today I know that there are many variations of the Hippocratic Oath. As I said, doctors do not take it in its original form, but I think that what I quoted was okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I found the article. I'm just going to link it in the chat, so maybe it will be useful for finalizing the paper.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no any more questions, thank you very much. And this is the end of our first session. We will go on a short break. We've extended our deadline a little bit. So let's say around like 10 minutes, maybe maximum break. And then we will continue on to our next session, which is Serbian session on the antiquity. So see you after the break. Thank you very much again, Anna and Isidora.